like in every country, people in China are searching for values, for meaning in life. People are somewhat dissatisfied with the purely materialistic world. The government over the past, say, 10, 15, 20 years has been trying to make use of what it calls traditional Chinese values and religion to bolster its rule. The state sees itself as permitting religious life, but not encouraging it.
Can religion be practiced in China?
Religion can be practiced in China. It really depends on what kind of religion and how you want to practice it. But officially, the government permits five religious groups in China. That would be Buddhism as the biggest religion, Taoism as China's indigenous religion, Islam, which came to China about 1200, 1300 years ago, and then Christianity, which is divided into two religious groups in China, Catholicism and Protestantism. So there are official religious organizations that allow people to practice there. There are officially permitted temples for Buddhists and Taoists, mosques for Muslims, and churches for Christians. And then there's also a thriving gray area underground scene, which is somewhat tolerated by the government, depending on the situation. But by and large, people can practice. But the problem is if they don't practice in the official religious organizations or places of worship, then they can get into trouble. And if they're a member of any other religious group, then they are not theoretically allowed to practice in China at all.
What does practicing religion in China look like?
So as in many things in China, there's sort of the official way of doing things, and then there's the way it actually plays out on the ground. So religion is a great lens for looking at China. There's the official and the unofficial, and the two coexist sometimes uneasily, sometimes in an okay fashion. Much of China's traditional religious life doesn't fit neatly into Buddhism or Taoism. There is a huge array of practices such as ancestor worship or worshiping holy mountains or deified historical figures like famous generals in history or something like that, that don't really fit into those groups exactly. And that's called popular religion or folk religion. That is also something that the government used to consider superstitious and which it now is trying to incorporate in its belief system or the system of beliefs that it allows, and has done so by calling it cultural heritage. And there they've borrowed the UNESCO term intangible cultural heritage to allow these religious groups to organize. They don't call them religion. They say it's just culture. Let me give you an example of folk or popular religion. The mountain outside of Beijing is called Miaofengshan, or the mountain of the wondrous peak. At the top of it is a deity, a Taoist deity, but it's not run by the Taoist Association of China. It's not an official religious activity center, as they call it. It's rather run by the local tourism authority. And so on some level, you can say, oh, well, this is just a tourist attraction. You pay an entrance fee and you go in. But it also is a place of intense worship. In fact, you could arguably say it's the most important religious location place in all of Beijing. It's had this incredibly important pilgrimage for a couple of centuries. And in the springtime, for 2 weeks, tens of thousands of people go up there on a pilgrimage. So this is something that the government realizes is important to many people. And so it says, okay, we can allow this as kind of a tourist attraction, folk cultural heritage. We're not going to redefine our whole religious system to incorporate it into the system. So it's not officially religion, but we'll allow it to happen. And that happens in a lot of places across the country.
How does the Chinese government view religion?
In some ways, the state sees itself as permitting religious life, but not encouraging it. So members of the Communist Party, and there are about 100 million members of the Communist Party, are supposed to be atheist. And it is a problem for party members if they're caught worshiping in church or going to mosque or going to a temple. So they are not really allowed to do that. Other people are allowed to do it. So the state sort of sees itself as a neutral player. The reality, though, is that it also was worried about religion because religion can be a form of civil society. So civil society being a part of society that's not under government control. Its biggest, say, nightmare with religion is that it might be something like the Catholic Church was in Cold War Poland, where you had a center of power really outside of government control, this very important part of society, or the way that Buddhism is for Tibetans, where it is part of daily life and society and even political control. So somebody like the Dalai Lama or the Panchen Lama having a political role in Tibetan society. It does not want that at all. If it's just something you do in your private life, it's okay. If you get too organized or you pose any kind of a potential threat to the party monopoly over political life, then you get closed down. So that's why these unofficial groups, like say unofficial churches, underground churches, they're kind of okay as long as you're just 20 or 30 people meeting in somebody's living room. But if you go out and build a big church and form a network, then you get on the government's radar screen and they can get quite nervous about that sort of thing. It's the same thing with Islam. They are worried, especially, I would say, about Christianity and Islam because these two Abrahamic faiths are seen as having extensive overseas ties. Whereas Buddhism and Taoism and folk religion, they feel is a little easier to control. Now, that's maybe not always true, but that's how they kind of see it. The government over the past, say, 10, 15, 20 years has been trying to make use of what it calls traditional Chinese values and religion to bolster its rule in a way that is somewhat analogous to how other authoritarian states also use their culture's traditions, such as Russia using the Orthodox Church. It's not that Xi Jinping, for example, goes and prays in the temple, but this explosion of intangible cultural heritage has really happened over the past 15 years or so. And not all intangible cultural heritage is religious, but a lot of it is. This pilgrimage that I mentioned outside of Beijing, the pilgrimage itself is intangible cultural heritage and gets government subsidies. The groups that go up there, they also get subsidized. And so the government wants to support this because I think they realize that people do need something to believe in, and not everyone's going to believe in communism. And if you have to believe in something, then it's better that you believe in what they think is a more easily controlled faith like Buddhism, Taoism, folk belief, rather than Christianity or Islam. And I think to some degree that is working. These working class religious groups that I've been studying in China for about a decade, they are overall supportive of the government's efforts. They think the government was against them in the past. Now they support them and they think that's a good thing. So I think it makes them better predisposed toward government policies. I just think it doesn't really work for people of other faiths. It doesn't work for Muslims and it doesn't work really for Christians.
How is the government involved in religious life?
The state has a Bureau of Religious Affairs, State Administration for Religious Affairs, and it runs 5 bodies, one for each of the 5 groups. And they then run the churches and mosques and temples that you find across China, the official ones. So it allows the priests, it allows the imams, it allows the nuns or whatever to run these places of worship. They all have to go to indoctrination meetings. They all have to follow parties' rules and stuff like that. Sermons, for example, in churches might have to be vetted. I don't know if they're always vetted, but in theory, they could be vetted ahead of time. Not everything goes through the government censor, but people know where the lines are. So if you're a pastor in a church, you're not going to probably give a sermon supporting workers' rights because that would get you into a political problem very quickly. So, in theory, the government vets these kinds of things to make sure that religious life is apolitical. And many of these churches and mosques and temples are quite popular and full of worshipers. So, if you're quite happy to just say, church for me is just about going to a service once a week for an hour, and I go and I take communion and I go home and that's it, then that's maybe you're okay with that. Then that's fine. But if you say, well, religion is part of my daily life, I want to live it out in my daily life, my beliefs, I want to participate in charitable events, I want to run homeless shelters, or I want to do something like that, maybe because I have the Buddhist concept of dana, which is charity, that would be more difficult. Again, they might allow you, if it's purely apolitical and it doesn't make the government look bad, to do something like that, but you could get into trouble more quickly that way.
How do people in China view religion?
So this term in Chinese, 宗教, is something that was brought over from the West via Japan as a term to describe a discrete set of practices and organizations that the modern bureaucratic state could interact with. This wasn't the way Chinese society was run prior to the 20th century. And it's not the way most societies were run prior to the 20th century. So this sort of modern Western idea of religion and state being separated is something that many countries had to come to grips with, including China. So when you say religion in China, most people tend to think of something that's very political, that the state controls. They're much more comfortable in talking about faith or practice. So faith, the term xinyang, is much more neutral. It doesn't have this political baggage. And people will say things. I've seen Communist Party members in temples and they have incense in their hands and they're bowing in front of a statue. And I say, isn't this like religious practice? Aren't you a Communist Party member? You're supposed to be atheist. They'll say, oh, that doesn't matter. This is just traditional Chinese culture. This isn't religion. I'm just doing this to show respect, but I'm not religious. This is why when you ask in opinion polls, do you believe in the religion of this or that? People will say, oh, no, I'm not really. I'm not. They might think then you're asking, are they a formal member of a temple? Are they in the clergy? But if you say, do you go to temple regularly? Then they will say yes in much higher numbers. So I think religion is a sensitive issue. The term religion, that's why many people talk about faith, belief. And it's much more interesting to ask people what they do. Do they go to temple? Do they light incense? Do they pray before their kids' college entrance exams or something like that? And then you get very high response rates for that, much more in line with other parts of the world.
How does the concept of the separation of church and state compare between China and other countries?
Yeah, Western countries, of course, had this struggle for centuries over what role there should be between church and state. And this is something that we're quite familiar with. The American solution is probably the most radical of most Western countries that I can think of, in that it firmly enshrines absolute religious freedom. In fact, you could argue the United States was made up to some degree of religious refugees, who pilgrims and stuff like that, who couldn't practice back in their home country in England or wherever, and went to what became the United States, the colonies there. So, yeah, I think it's much more important from an American perspective. And Americans often bristle at this idea that the state should play a role in religious life. But when you look at many countries around the world, the state does play quite a big role in religious life. The Church of England, for example, the head of state, the king, is also the head of the Church of England, and so on and so forth. In Germany, for example, people pay a tax to their religion. They can opt out of it, but it's sort of managed by the state. The state then channels this money, takes money from your taxes and channels it to churches or mosques or synagogues and so on and so forth. So it's something that other states do have. But I think in China, the state would see itself even in a more hands-on way, in that it would draw more on Chinese tradition, where in Chinese tradition, emperors and the state would determine between what is heterodox and what is orthodox. So orthodox being Zheng and heterodox being Xie. And so traditionally, emperors or the bureaucracy underneath them would say, okay, this sect is okay, we'll bring it in, it'll become officially accepted. This is not okay, it's heterodox, is banned. And they still do that today, the government. So they banned certain Christian sects. They banned this folk religious movement called Falun Gong, which gets a lot of attention overseas because it's very politically active. So it's something that the state feels comfortable doing because they see themselves as a continuation of Chinese traditional rule.